wanted to emphasize this program season. Cyber hacking was at the top of our list. But I will also be honest with you that none of us could have imagined how topical it would be right at this particular time in our nation's history, with everything that has come out about emails and WikiLeaks and potential foreign influence on the elections. So I couldn't be more pleased that this evening we're kicking off this topic with Dr. Adam Segal. Dr. Segal is an expert on security issues, technology development, and Chinese domestic and foreign policy. He is the Ira A. Lipman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he directs the Council's Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program. The Council on Foreign Relations funded or sponsored an independent task force report on open, global, secure, and resilient internet, for which Dr. Segal was the project director. Dr. Segal, I think, is perfectly positioned to speak to us tonight because he has experience in the worlds of policy and the world of academia. He has taught at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, at MIT's Center for International Studies, at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences, and at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He has also taught at Vassar and at Columbia University. Dr. Segal holds a bachelor's and a PhD in government from Cornell University and a master's in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. His most recent book was published this year by Public Affairs, The Hacked World Order: How Nations Fight, Trade, Maneuver, and Manipulate in the Digital Age is the title of his book, and we're very interested in hearing his remarks on that topic for us tonight. Dr. Segal?
Thank you, and thank you very much to the World Affairs Forum for inviting me. I also did not know that this was a good time to publish a book, so I think we were all caught unawares. And thank you all for coming out tonight. What I'm going to do tonight is try to give you some framework for thinking about all the things that are happening. I'll give you some definitions. I'll talk about how we got to this place. Why are things so bad? I'll talk about U.S. foreign policy. And then I'm going to try to end on a positive note because it's really depressing to end on a negative note. That's almost always where I end up. But you're going to see my heart's not really in it. So before I begin, though, I want you to hold three big thoughts in your head. Right? These are kind of, I think, three larger trends that we need to be aware of. And the first one, has clearly been prominent, is that our vulnerability is only going up. Right? Everything that can be connected can be hacked, and more things are being connected. Right? Two stories to illustrate this. The first is my neighbors just renovated their kitchen. They invited us over for dinner. And I said to them at dinner, "Do you realize that your oven is talking to my Wi-Fi router?" They had no idea. They have a new GE oven, which is Wi-Fi enabled, in case you wanted to turn it on before you got home to start heating your roast. I had not tried to hack into it, but I assumed that the password is something like GE oven 12345 or password 12345, and we are only hooking more and more things. A much scarier example happened last year. Two hackers trying to hack into a car. They were about 10 miles away from the car. The reporter was driving the car outside of St. Louis on the highway. The hackers turned the wipers on and off. They turned the heater on and off. They turned the radio on and off. And they turned the car off. And they had to pull them inside. These are not normal hackers. These were two guys who used to work at the NSA, the National Security Agency, and they were being funded by the U.S. government to try to convince the automobile industry that we were going to have a problem. but this is the world we're moving into. This is the world that's called the Internet of Things, right? More and more devices that are connected to the Internet. By 2020, so just 4 years from now, 50 billion devices connected to the Internet. So what we've seen the last 6 months are hacks that are really data-driven. Right? Take data, steal data, put it out on the Internet. What we might see in the future are hacks that actually cause physical outcomes, right? Destruction and damage. So that's the one big thought I want you to keep in your head. The second big thought is, this is not the future we expected. Right? When we had all thought about cyberspace 10 or 15 years ago, the image was an individual hacker, right? The guy in the hoodie in his basement, or maybe terrorist groups were going to be radically empowered. Right? Nation states were going to fall behind, and we're going to have all of these individual hackers that are really shaping this space. But it turns out that governments are incredibly powerful in this space. China, Russia, the United States have all rushed into this space, into cyberspace, and are using it for their nation-state objectives and political objectives. The other countries don't operate with the same constraints the United States does. The United States has what's called Title 50, Title 18, right, Title 12 that control where the military can operate, where law enforcement can operate, where intelligence agencies can operate. We have a very traditional conception of what are foreign threats and what are domestic threats. Other countries don't operate that way. Right? They have a much more comprehensive view. And so they're operating very, very differently than we are in this space. So more and more vulnerable, states are rushing into this space. And then third and finally, the Internet is an American invention, but the future of cyberspace is probably not American. It's probably Asian. Right now, as a region, Asia is has the largest number of users. Right? But in penetration, Asia is still only sixth. There's 650 million Internet users in China. That means there's another 600 million to come online. There are about 380 million users in India. That means there's another 800 million to come online. 5 to 7 million Internet users added a month in India. Most on their cell phones, not on desktops or laptops. And the vast majority of these users are much younger than any of us in this room. They're under 25. And they're going to have a very different conception about how do you use the Internet? What does privacy on the Internet mean? What does security mean? What the balance between privacy and security should be. So they're going to start shaping the Internet for the next 20 years. For the last 20 years, it's been the United States. The next 20 years, it's going to be Asia. And probably the leader is going to be China. When we think about what are the pillars of cyber power or cyber influence, I think they have 4 components. A large economy and technological capabilities. A private sector that's pushing in the same direction as the government. A military that is creative and in some ways pushes the envelope in cyberspace. And then a story to tell. What is cyberspace for? We have all those things. The 9 of the top 12 platforms in cyberspace are all American, right? Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, all these things. But China has them too. Baidu is a competitor to Google. Xiaomi is a competitor to Apple. Huawei has been growing very competitive to Cisco. So Chinese companies are globalizing as well. China has a story about the Internet, right? We have spoke about the cyberspace as being global and open and free. The Chinese say, no. Cyberspace is like every other sovereign space, like the sea, like the air, and countries should be able to shape it any way they see fit. And the way that we see fit is some things should be allowed in and some things shouldn't. It's a pretty attractive idea to lots of countries. And if you have an authoritarian government or an unstable government, that's the view of cyberspace that you prefer to the American. And we know the Chinese have been very, very capable at hacking. So the Chinese are going to be very, very important moving forward shaping the Internet. So let's try to keep those 3 kind of big ideas in the back of our heads. Real quickly, some definitions, right? Because the papers always talk about cyber war, hacking, and it's very important, I think, to distinguish what we're talking about, because each of the types of attacks have different policy implications and involve different parts of the US government and different kind of actors. The types of attack that affect most of us every day is crime, right? Most cyber crime, so your theft of your ID, credit card theft, increasingly what's called ransomware, right? You download something you shouldn't, your computer gets encrypted, and they say, if you want your computer to be decrypted, send us $300, $500. This is the fastest growing area. Most of this is not have anything to do with states, although some criminal actors have some connections to states. But this is what most of us are going to see in our daily lives. The second largest category is espionage. Cyber espionage or spying. And this is what everybody does. Everybody spies on everybody else. This is in part what the Snowden revelations were about. Right? Edward Snowden, the NSA contractor, showed that the US is very, very good at hacking into other people's computers and using its role at the center of the internet for gathering data. But we know that the Chinese have been very, very assertive on cyber espionage, in particular for intellectual property theft. Chinese hackers, mostly tied to the government, stealing intellectual property, stealing business secrets, and other things as needed. Many of us will be probably caught up in that, either at your work or in your personal life if you happen to deal with Russia or China or something else, you could be targeted for that. The third category is the one we've been seeing most recently, what I would call cyber conflict. Cyber attacks that try to create political outcomes, usually through distortion or release of data. The most prominent case of these have been what's called distributed denial of service attacks. One way to think about distributed denial of service attacks is like 15 fat people trying to go through a revolving door at once. Right? It's jammed up. So basically you take a lot of data and you direct it at a website to knock it offline. People do this all the time to wipe websites they don't like. Right? You don't like Planned Parenthood, you knock them offline. Somebody says something you don't like, you knock them off. We saw in the summer of 2012, the Iranians were angry at the US, probably for attacking them on cyber, so they knocked US banks and financial systems offline. Pretty big attacks through distributed denial of service. But there's really no damage. Right? Most of those are inconveniences. You can't online bank for a couple hours, you can't use the service, but right now it's mostly been what we've seen with the attacks on the Democratic National Committee and John Podesta's emails are what we call influence operations. Steal data and then dump it publicly to try and influence public debates. We know that the Russians have done that throughout Eastern Europe and Eurasia, and we're seeing it happen now. But we've seen it happen in other cases as well. The Syrian Electronic Army, for example, hacked the Twitter feed of the AP. They hacked the Twitter feed of the AP, and they tweeted, there's been an explosion in the White House. So, automated trading bots, which basically collect Twitter for good news and bad news, and then make rapid trades on the stock market, saw that and quickly started selling. Very, very high-speed trades. The stock market dropped about 160 points until everybody realized this was just a hack, and then it went back up. But that was a significant economic back and forth based on taking advantage of complex systems. Right? Put data out there and see how we do it. So crime, conflict, espionage, and then finally what I would call cyber war. Right? The use of cyber attacks to create physical outcomes or in a military conflict. And here we've only seen one case. We only have one case where a cyber attack created physical outcomes, and that seems to be the US-Israel operation, the alleged attack on Natanz, the Iranian centrifuge project. So in that case, a very, very sophisticated piece of malware, malicious software, was injected into the Iranian nuclear program. Very, very sophisticated because the Iranian nuclear program was not connected to the internet. The Iranians knew, don't connect to the internet. So somehow or another, the malicious software got from Israel or the United States and got into the Iranian system. Somebody might plug something in when they weren't supposed to. Got into the system, and then spent a long time speeding up the centrifuges and slowing them down. Speeding them up, slowing them down, but sending a signal to the operators, everything is okay. We've all seen those movies, like bank heist movies, right? When you take a little film of the bank vault, is everything's okay? And you put it up so they see that everything's okay. This is what the malicious software did. Sent a signal saying everything's all right. We think it destroyed about 1,000 centrifuges, and then somehow or another got out to the open. Either somebody got too aggressive or assertive, somebody connected something, and it spread. It spread to almost every country in the world, including the United States. Came back and infected Chevron. But the software was so sophisticated that it was designed to only work when it saw a specific configuration of Siemens computers. It only was going to do damage when it saw this very, very specific configuration, and it had a clock in it. It turned itself off after June something, and would do no damage. So this is the one case we really have of cyber war, using a malicious software to create physical damage. But the future, we're going to see more. Right? Go back to my original point about Internet of Things. And we know that all militaries are thinking about cyber attacks. Right? Particularly in the beginning stage of any military conflict. What do you want to do? You want to knock the other side's command and control, their surveillance out. Cyber attacks are going to play a role in that. We know the Chinese have written a lot about it, the Russians have written a lot about it, the US government has written a lot about it. How do you do that? And right now the US government has said we're using cyber attacks against ISIS. Nobody really knows what that means. In the past, that has meant some kind of changing dates on people's cell phones, right? Trying to drive terrorists out into the open so you can strike them with drone strikes. But we're going to use it more and more. So that's cyber war. So that's what states are using these attacks for. How did we get here? Like, why is it so hard to defend yourself? Right, so part of the reason why it's so hard is because nobody thought the internet was going to be a global platform used by 3-4 billion people. Right? The internet started as what was called the ARPANET, which was a US experiment, partly driven by the Defense Department wanting to create a secure communications platform in case there was ever a nuclear attack in the United States, but also to help scientists cooperate and use supercomputers. So at the beginning stages when they built this ARPANET, there was no reason for security because it was 20 scientists. And they all knew each other. And they had no reason to think that the scientist at Stanford was going to inject some type of malware into the system. So there was no security built into it. As it globally expanded, then people started realizing, oh, we have this system that has no security on it, so we've constantly, as we increased complexity, had to put security on afterwards. Security has never been built in, it's never been designed. That's one problem. The second problem is that the economic incentives are very bad for security. Companies want to get their product out there as quickly as possible. Right? They want you to use it, and they want all your friends to use it, and they want to create network effects. Right? The more people who use it, the more likely you're going to continue using it. So the model has always been rush the product out as quickly as possible, and if we discover a flaw, we'll fix it in the next iteration. Well, again, so you rush things out there with security problems, and then you have to address them afterwards. So you have this huge network effects. Companies really had no reason to invest in cybersecurity because they didn't see any cost to it. It was very hard to say, well, what did it actually mean when you got hacked? It didn't seem to have any material cost on your bottom line. And investing in security just seemed to be a loss. How could you prove that anything did or did not happen? And we can see that the incentives are still kind of screwed up. Right? Many of you have seen that Yahoo said that they lost, or they were hacked, and 500 million accounts were breached. Right? Well, in their report today, or yesterday, Yahoo said this made no material impact on our business. Right? So if companies are paying no cost, then they're not going to invest anything into cybersecurity. And we saw this happen with Target, right? Again, Target got hacked. Who paid most of the cost? It was the credit card companies and the banks. Target's stock went down, but then it went right back up and everybody started shopping again for Christmas. Somebody lost their job at Target, but generally there's been none. So economic incentives have not been great for Christmas. And then finally, people do really dumb things. Right? I don't generally like to tell this story, but until about 6 months ago, I was the only person at the council who did not have to do cybersecurity training. I assumed that I knew what I was doing. And then one morning I was actually traveling in India, and it was probably about 6:30, and I hadn't had my first cup of coffee yet. And I got an email that said, "Dear Dr. Segal, we noticed that on your blog you have material that we think is copyrighted. If you don't take it down in 48 hours, we're going to serve you with papers. Here's a link to the violating material." And I clicked on the link because it was 6:30 in the morning and someone was threatening to sue me. And it said, "Show up to cybersecurity training next week." Because we test ourselves all the time, right? And we're running what's called white hat attacks. And I made a mistake. And people make mistakes. In one study, anywhere between 50% of the people to 95% of the people who find a thumb drive on the ground will plug it in. Right? Because they think, oh, somebody lost this thumb drive, and maybe I'll help them find it. But this is probably how the Russians got into the CyberNet, which is the U.S. government, the U.S. Department of Defense's most secure network, because we think the Russians left thumb drives around the bathrooms of defense contractor conferences, and they sold them in the market in Kabul, and people came home, went to work, and they plugged it in. Right? So people do dumb things. People, at some point, everyone's going to do something dumb. So it's very hard to create a system that's going to keep attackers out. Right? And the attacker only has to be right once. The defender has to be right all the time. The defender has to be right across millions of lines of code, probably tens of networks, hundreds of devices. The attacker only has to be right once. And if you're a government or a nation state, you can spend time. You spend a lot of money and a lot of time trying to get into a high-value target. Just keep trying over and over again until somebody who's in India and hasn't had their coffee yet puts them in. Then you're in. Right? So it's very, very hard to keep people out. So what does the U.S. government try to do in this space? Right? So internationally, we have basically decided that this is a national security problem. And as with most national security problems, but in terrorism in particular, we try to push it out. Right? We want to deal with it before it gets to U.S. Boundaries, U.S. networks. We want to deal with it out there. So the U.S. government created what's called Cyber Command. Right? So we now have a designated part of the Defense Department that is going to wage cyber war. Defense budgets have been flat, if not falling, except for 3 areas. Special Operations Forces, drones, and cyber. Those are the only 3 parts of the defense budget that have not gone down. They're going up. And by next year, 2018, there'll be about 6,000 people working in cyber command. From about 1,000 3 years ago to 6,000. So we've decided that this cyber is a strategic problem. We're going to push it out as a defense problem. The problem is that cyber doesn't operate the way that other traditional defenses work. Right? In the nuclear age, in the Cold War, we had deterrence, both conventional and nuclear. We had a certain number of nuclear weapons, and the Soviets had a certain number of nuclear weapons. And we deterred each other. Right? We realized that if you launch a nuclear weapon, it's going to cause mutually assured destruction. We had arms tests, right? We exploded missiles, we fired missiles, we exploded nuclear weapons. We could position missiles in a silo. The Russians could count those. Right? We could fly planes over. We could put a submarine out into the ocean. You can't do any of that in cyberspace. Right? You can't count cyber weapons. Everybody is carrying a cyber weapon with them right now. Right? You can't count code. And you can't, how do you convince the other side that you have these capabilities? Part of the problem with cyber capabilities is you can tell the other side, oh yes, we have a really, really capable malicious software, really, really capable code that can get into your centrifuges. Well, they're going to do everything they can to patch those centrifuges, and that weapon is no good any longer. Right? So once you demonstrate that capability, it's gone. The defense can patch. So it's very hard to deter. The other problem is, in the nuclear age, we knew who was attacking us, or who possibly would attack us. Right? We would see a missile lift off from Russia and fly over the pole, and we would know. Right? In cyber, we have what's called the attribution problem. Who really is behind the attack? Right? That's why Trump could say, it's not the Russians behind the DNC, it's a 400-pound guy sitting on his bed. Right? Because the attacker can route the attack from different networks. He can take over computers and launch an attack from there. He can do lots of things that will hide where the attack is coming from. Now we're getting a lot better at it. Right? I happen to believe that we know it's the Russians. We haven't provided very much evidence that it is the Russians, but I suspect we have. Right? That's because attribution is not just where the computer attack came from. Right? It's not just a set of what's called internet protocol addresses, IP addresses. It's also other intelligence that we have. Not just the computer, and maybe the guy calling up his mom and saying, today was really busy, I was hacking the DNC, which we gathered through other ways. So you have a whole kind of picture that you can put together to attribute. But again, it's very hard to release attribution without releasing our own capabilities. So probably one of the reasons why the US government has not provided very much evidence that it's the Russians is because we don't want to live there. You can see this happened with the case with Sony hacking. You all remember Sony was attacked because the North Koreans didn't like the interview, which made fun of the Korean leader. Movies were stolen, computers were destroyed, if not damaged. People were embarrassed. Right? Personal emails put online, racist jokes about the president. We found out that Angelina Jolie doesn't make as much as male directors, and they don't really like her at Sony. And the US government came out and said, we think it's North Korean hackers. And they released some evidence. But the evidence was very circumstantial. Right? There's Korean language in the software. They are attacking from IP addresses that we know North Korean hackers have used before. They attempt to attack between 9 and 5 Pyongyang time. Right? When people would check into work and check out. So all of that is helpful, but it isn't complete. Korean language in the software, we know that the underground criminal hackers, they all share the software. Right? You buy it, you sell it, so it goes around. People also use IP addresses, they use the infrastructure. And 9 to 5, that range is a lot of countries. It's Korea, it's China, it's Thailand, it's lots of other places. So what happened, in fact, in this case, was there was a leak. But the way the US government probably knew for sure that North Korea was finding hacking was the South Koreans had hacked into the United States. Right? A friend of ours, an ally, they had hacked into the United States. And the US government saw that. The US government hacked into South Korea to see who was hacking into us and what they were gathering. And while the US government was sitting on the South Korean computers, they saw that, oh, by the way, the South Koreans had hacked into North Korea. So the US followed that up, and they sat on North Korean computers. So the way that the US could, in the end, identify and attribute this attack to North Korea was through hacking. And they didn't necessarily want to reveal it, but it came out in Stone Revelation, so in the end, they just burned that. So it's very hard to create a deterrent in cyberspace, and you can see we don't really have one. If we really had a deterrent in cyberspace, the Russians would have probably thought twice about hacking into the DNC. The other big thing that we've done is try to create some rules of the road. Right? Here's this new area of international conflict. And in the past, in nuclear age, conventional weapons, biological weapons, we had arms control treaties. As I said before, it's very hard to think about how you control cyber weapons. You can't count them, you can't reduce them. And so the US has said, well, we think the laws of armed conflict, right? We have these Geneva principles, proportionality, neutrality, distinction, that have applied to warfare for hundreds of years now. We think they should apply to cyberspace. I think it's going to be hard to figure out how they really apply, but this is the conversation we should have. And the Chinese and the Russians have basically said, yeah, we're not sure. We think cyber is so different that we need to have whole new treaties. And so we haven't gotten very far with the Chinese and the Russians on this discussion. We've tried to say there should be some rules, and the Chinese and the Russians have kind of nodded their head and said, okay. So that's what we've tried to do on the international front. Really deter our attackers, but it's very hard to create a deterrent. The other big thing is, what have we been doing at home? And here we've really had kind of three large questions or debates that have slowed us down at home. The first one is, who should be in charge? So if you think about it, .gov, right, government networks, those are defended by the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Homeland Security is in charge of also defending critical infrastructure. So power lines, transportation lines, other places. And we have .mil, right, so military networks, and clearly the DoD is in charge of that. And we have .edu, .com, .art, everything else. And who's in charge of that? Nobody. We're all on our own, basically, to defend us. The government takes no responsibility for defending us, which might be fine if it's a criminal attacker, but if it's a nation-state attacker, we don't expect a company to defend itself from Chinese invasion. We might expect it to some help from the government to defend itself from a Chinese attack. So the issue has been who should defend and where, and you don't want to create incentives for companies not to invest in cybersecurity. Right? If companies think the government is going to come to their behest, then they're going to free ride. Right? So how do you get this balance right between where the government should step in and where the private sector should step out? There's been a huge debate also about who in the government should defend us. Right? All of you have flown. We've all encountered the TSA face-to-face. I don't think it makes many of us feel much safer. Many people have the same feeling about DHS and cyber. There's not a lot of expertise, or there traditionally has not been a lot of expertise in DHS. They had a difficult time about keeping people. All of the expertise is in the NSA. But the NSA cannot operate on US networks. It's a foreign intelligence gathering arm. So, because of Constant Thomas and other laws, we can't operate on US networks. So we've been trying to get this balance right between, well, can the NSA support the DHS? Can the DoD support the DHS? And how do you build this? The other thing, as I mentioned, is how do you get this balance right between private incentives and public incentives? And here, not surprisingly given the state of the Congress these days, is that we're not going to regulate it. There was some sense at some point that there would be regulations put in place, and there are. Critical infrastructure has some regulations, right? The banking sector today released new guidelines on what levels of security banks have to achieve. The energy grid has some levels of security they have to achieve. But for everybody else, it's a set of what are called voluntary frameworks. It's put out by the National Institute of Science and Technology, NIST. And it's a voluntary framework that is, the idea is going to be to create market incentives. So you can turn around and say to your insurer, I met these standards that were voluntarily described, I want to buy cyber insurance. And once you start having a market, then you can start having the right types of investment in other ways. Finally, there's this idea about information sharing. If I see an attack, it helps if I share that attack with everybody else. Right? If I tell everybody else at the council, somebody sent me an email that said my website had copyrighted material on it, don't fall for that, then they're much less likely to do it. So this was called information sharing. And it took us a very, very long time to get it, but finally the Congress passed a bill that said the private sector can share with other private sector companies, the private sector can share with the government, and the government, most importantly, can share with the private sector. It's going to take a little bit about how to get that working. There's privacy concerns, of course, involved, and what the information is, but that was kind of... So those are all the things that we've been doing, but you can tell, and in fact, the Obama administration has done a lot in cyberspace. Passed a lot of executive orders, moved the sharing along, created what are called information sharing organizations, executive orders on punishing people, foreign nations for sanctions, created cyber command. So there's a whole list of things that the Obama administration has done, but I don't think anyone thinks we're in fact any safer, which is a very bad place to be, but that seems to be reality. So this is why I promise you I'm going to end on a slightly more positive note. So what I think the three positives are so far. The first is this discussion about norms and rules. Right? It's actually, if I give this talk a year and a half ago, I would have told you that it's very unlikely that we would get any agreement on anything. But we've actually seen one pretty big breakthrough and one minor breakthrough. The big breakthrough is on the Chinese and cyber espionage, the theft of intellectual property. Right? This is what some people have called the greatest transfer of wealth in human history. The scope and scale of this was seemingly massive. And the US government very, very slowly started ratcheting up the pressure on China. Right? First, it was what was called naming and shaming. So what used to happen was there would be a big hack. Many of you may remember Google was one of the first companies to announce that they were hacked. That was 2010, 2011. Google was hacked, and a reporter would write it up, and they would say, Google was hacked, and then they would call somebody in the US government, and the US government would say, it's a nation-state attacker, and they wouldn't say anymore. And then the reporter would call me, and I would say, it's China. And then about 6 months later, the US government took me out of the loop. Right? So in about April of 2013, the US government started saying, no, these are China-based attackers. And then it said, not only are they China-based attackers, but these are Chinese government hackers. We think they're connected to the People's Liberation Army. They may freelance, and sometimes they hack for personal gain, sometimes they hack for commercial gain, but they are directed by the Chinese government. Then we indicted 5 hackers from China. So they hacked into US Steel, Westinghouse, and some other companies, and the US government released their identities. Again, using kind of these IP addresses and some other information. And said, we've indicted these 5 PLA hackers for espionage. And the US government knew there was no chance that these guys would ever see the inside of the US court. But they were sending the signal to China that, yes, attribution is hard, but we're getting pretty good at it, and there'll be some costs. And then finally, right before President Xi Jinping came for his first summit meeting with President Obama, the government started leaking the idea that the US government was going to sanction high-level Chinese officials and Chinese companies. Maybe it would freeze their bank accounts in the United States. Maybe it would put travel restrictions on them so they couldn't come visit their kids studying at American universities. And then the Chinese showed up in September, and they agreed to an agreement on cyber espionage, where the United States and China said neither side will knowingly support cyber espionage for competitive advantage. Right? We're going to continue spying on each other for political and military reasons. That we're going to continue doing, but we're not going to steal intellectual property to help Congress. So that was in September. I think people were pretty skeptical that the Chinese were going to keep their end of the bargain, but so far, all the public evidence suggests that they either are following through, so the number of attacks seems to have gone down. Cybersecurity companies now report that the attacks have gone down. So either they're following it, or they're getting better. Right? Because the Chinese have always been considered to be much noisier hackers than the Russians. The FBI director Comey once described them as the drunk thief who knocks over the lamp as he's walking out the door with your television. Right? So Chinese hackers didn't really seem to care. They got in, they made a lot of noise, they took everything they got, they get out. The Russians, if they were in there, you would not know. Much, much quieter. So it may have been that the Chinese decided, well, being noisy is drawing a lot of attention, and we're going to reduce both the number of our attacks and the noise we make. So this may be a game, but it may be they're still going after high-value things, but they're just being much quieter. The Chinese went on and signed a similar agreement with the British, and then at the G7 and the G20, all of those countries signed this agreement. So years ago, I would have told you it's very unlikely that the United States could have gotten other countries to say there's good hacking, which is kind of the hacking the United States does, and there's bad hacking, there's the hacking to the Chinese do. I would have been very surprised that we would have managed to get all those countries to do it, but we did. We can, again, decide, 6 months from now, you read that the Chinese hacking has gone up, then that might be a winner. So we got that. The other norm, or set of norms, is a discussion at the UN. So there's a group of what are called the Group of Government Experts at the UN, that represent 20 countries. And they have been trying to discuss, can we agree on some rules of the road, right? Because again, we don't know what the red lines are in a cyber attack. The US has said, if you do a cyber attack that creates physical destruction and death, we will pretty much treat that as a use of force or an armed attack, right? And we can respond any way we want. So, you cyber attack something, it blows up, the US might fire a cruise missile back at you. But it's not clear everything below that threshold. Right? What happens if the attackers take out the stock market for a day? Is that enough for the US to use kinetic force? Does it have to be 2 days? Does it have to be 4 days? So that's not clear. So can we start to talk about some kind of guidelines? You don't want that kind of uncertainty with China and Russia. You don't want the Chinese to think, no, 2 days is fine. Right? But we think, no, 2 days is bad, 1 day is good. Right? You want to have some kind of clear perception about what they're doing. So last year, the group of government experts came up, we said, we all can agree on 4 norms. Four basic norms about cyberspace. Countries should not launch cyber attacks that interfere with the operation of critical infrastructure during peacetime. Countries shouldn't interfere with the computer emergency response teams, right? So those are teams that come to assistance during that. You have a responsibility for attacks that come out of your territory, and you should help another country that's being attacked. Those are the 4 norms that everybody agrees. Right? You're not supposed to attack other countries during peacetime anyway. So that first one's a pretty low bar. And there's a lot of definitional issues there. What is critical infrastructure? It's not the same. The electoral system, right? Elections are not part of the infrastructure. That's one thing we discovered after the DNC. Sony was not part of the infrastructure. So, and what does disrupt mean? Right? Because we know that countries attack or penetrate other countries' critical infrastructure, in part because they're preparing an attack. Right? It's called preparing the battlefield. As I mentioned before, if there is a war between China and Russia, or US and Russia, or US and China, we're going to want to turn the lights off. And they're going to want to turn the lights off for us. And to do that, you have to do intelligence reporting. So those types of attacks seem to be okay. Because at the time that you're there, you're not interfering. Just the interfering might come with 2 or 3 strokes later. So pretty low bar, but again, better than we had before. And I told you, I was just going to look for anything to be optimistic about. So that's the first. The second is, I think there's been a radical change in just awareness of the problem, which is converting into economic incentives and investment, right? If I had given this talk 3 years ago, 4 years ago, most of you would have said that's for computer geeks, I have no interest in it. But now we all see it's part of our lives. And then many of you probably sit on the boards of companies, you're now responsible, right, for the cybersecurity of your company, and you have to do something. You might not know what that is now, but you know that you have to do something. So we're now getting a lot of more market attention into that, and I'm more optimistic that we're going to start getting the market incentives right for investing. Third and final would be a technological change. So as I mentioned before, right now, the offense always has the advantage over the defense. Just given the structure that we have, the technology we have. People who are more technologically sophisticated than I am think that that will change. And that will change over time, in part because a combination of what's called big data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. Right? So collection more and more and more data, gives you more and more sense of what should be happening on the network, and you spot an anomaly almost immediately. Something that's not supposed to be there. And it gets better over time, and you more and more take the individual out. People don't have to make choices. The system itself learns over time of this. So technologically, we may be turning a corner. But as I said, these are all things that are not going to come anytime soon, right? These are all things that are happening over years. So the world we're going to live in right now is the one that I started with, and is the one that I'm striving for. So I'll stop there and take questions. Should I just copy? Yeah, sorry.
Fascinating talk, I really enjoyed it. A question basically about the alleged attack by the Russians on the U.S. electoral process. Can you discuss a little bit about your thinking about possible responses in light of the possible asymmetric vulnerability of the United States to sort of a cyber counterattack in terms of the norms that it sets in terms of response, either not responding at all or responding in a way that that would have an impact? And presumably releasing data may have less impact on the Russians than, say, a disruptive cyber attack on physically disruptive, but that raises the bar substantially. So if you could discuss that a bit.
Yeah, I think it's, it's a great question, and it's the debate that's been happening the last 2 weeks. So the issues on the table, I think you laid them out very, very well. So the U.S. government has alleged, the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Department of Human Services have come out and said it's the Russians. The Russians have attacked the DNC, and it's a high level of attribution. So then, what is the response going to be? And the issues are, as you said, are for a cyber response. We are probably more vulnerable to many attacks than most other countries, right? Our economy is heavily dependent on the internet. Our military is heavily dependent on the internet. And the Chinese, the Russians, are extremely capable. So there's a real risk of escalation. You launch a cyber attack that, again, we think is legitimate or proportional. And the Russians decide, no, that's not right. People have tried to come up with what a proportional cyber response would be. And the two examples that people have come up with are, one, try to embarrass Putin, right? So you expose where his money is offshore, or what his friends are doing, and you release that data. The Russians already think we've done that to them anyways, right? Many of you may remember the leaks from the Fonseca law company in Panama, released all this data about Russian oligarchs, and the Russians think we're behind them. So it's not clear to me that doing that more helps. The other is to try to dismantle Russian controls on the internet. And so Russia has a very heavily regulated, but that would be probably not particularly effective, and again, I think highly escalatory, right? Because the Russians basically think that we are already interfering with their domestic politics too. They view our support of the couple of called the color revolutions and Ukraine as being designed to destabilize them. So they would see this as a and I think they would respond in a way that we're not making. So I don't think a cyber attack is likely. I was talking with the gentleman earlier about yesterday, the day before, Vice President Biden said, we're going to respond, and no one's going to see it. And then somebody said, well, what are the American people going to know about it? And he said, well, I hope not. Which suggests that it's going to be a cyber attack. But the problem, again, as I said, if you're trying to create a deterrent, right? So we want to convince not only the Russians not to do it again, but also the North Koreans not to do it, and the Chinese and the Iranians. Having no one know about it is not a deterrent. So I think we're likely to do some type of cyber attacks that dismantle their ability to launch attacks, which we won't know about, which is probably what happens all the time. And we have to remember that the U.S. is not, it's not like we're not doing anything in the space. We are very active, probably, in this space. And we're probably trying to dismantle the system. I think it's much more likely that we will use economic sanctions, travel restrictions, which are not going to be that effective because the Russians are already, fairly highly sanctioned. And we would have to reveal, I don't think we're going to want to reveal intelligence. So I think it's going to be a particularly non-effective response. I think we're going to have to do something. Because the Russians have clearly crossed the line. But I don't think it's going to be
Would you care to comment on attacks that I call kind of lone wolf, but they're not lone wolf? People like Julian Assange, who is probably not a state actor, but has his own idiosyncrasies, and is like a wild card in the internet.
Yeah, so there are clearly individuals can have an impact, right? Assange, Snowden, right, was clearly at one point was probably an individual actor, but the larger impact, I think, in part is also driven by nation states, right? So Assange is releasing data that came from the Podesta and other hacks that came from, I think, Russian hackers. He has denied that it came from there, but that's the only thing that makes any sense, quite honestly. But yes, individuals clearly can have an impact, embarrassing, and trying to influence these debates. But I still think that nation states are the ones that have all of the intelligence and other gathering behind it that push these things out for a much larger impact.
Hi. One thing that scares the daylights out of me is in the West, and especially the United States, you have private corporations, you have the military, and you have the government, and they're very siloed. They have systems, technology, platforms, and engines, which they can't group, but they are genuinely separate. In a place like China, that is not the case, where it's systemic. Your private corporation is also highly interlocked with the military and highly interlocked with the government. So an attack, theoretically, from China, although it could be a hacker group, it could very well be planned and systemic throughout the whole society. I mean, how can the West deal with that, where they are totally in concert, even though they don't show that to you, where we are trying to remain some level of integrity between our organizations?
Yeah, I think you're right. Is that, as I said, we have Title 50, we have Title 18, we have these things that separate parts of the government and the government from the private sector. And that line is much thinner, if not non-existent, in China and Russia. The example that often comes up is Huawei. Right? So Huawei is a Chinese telecom manufacturer that has, it's very prominent now in Africa and Latin America and other places. Huawei was started by a PLA engineer, has tried to get into the U.S. market. It's mainly in third and fourth tier markets, but has been blocked to try to get into larger issues. So I think it is a problem, but we should also remember that the Chinese and Russians basically think the same thing about us. Right? We think it's really a clear line between the public sector and the private sector, but especially after the Snowden revelations, right, where the U.S. government, seemed to be backdooring and using U.S. companies to gain access to data, but the Chinese and Russians said, Microsoft is in the palm of the U.S. government too. The Chinese, one of the first reports identifying Chinese hackers came from Mandiant, a private cybersecurity company, which was bought by FireEye. And they produced a report soon after the New York Times was back and said, here are the PLA actors that did this attack. As soon as the Mandiant report came out, the Chinese press went through every board member and every person who worked at FireEye and Mandiant and said, former NSA, former FBI, former CIA, and said, yeah, these guys are a tool of the U.S. government. So I take your point, and I think it is true domestically. It is hard for us to get that right, and it's particularly hard right now because the technology companies are running so far away from the government. Because after the Snowden revelations, and they got all this pressure from China and Russia that said, you guys are, you're backdooring us. You're giving information to the NSA, and the U.S. companies ever since then have said, we don't want to be seen to be cooperating with the US government at all. And we had this big debate over encryption and privacy and all those other things. So I think it's even harder for us now because the private sector is running away. But I think, it's not that good to potential adversaries.
How safe do you think it is to do electronic banking, and what can we do to protect ourselves if we do that? And secondly, do you have any guidelines for us to keep our computers safe from hacking?
Yeah. So on the personal side, I'll just tell you what I do. But you should, I have a firewall installed. I update all of my software. So, we talk about this very, very sophisticated software, but something like 90 to 90% of most attacks happen because people don't update their software. So if you're constantly updating your software, you're in a good position. I have two-factor authentication set on everything that will allow me to do it. Right? So two-factor is you sign in with your password, and they send you a number to your cell phone. Right? And you have to enter that as well. So if I sign into my Twitter account from a different computer, it says, who are you? And it sends me a text to my phone, and I put that in. Most banks, financial systems, all can do that now. I would do that. Back up everything you have, but also make sure that you unplug the backup, because if you get ransomware, which is the encrypting, it can also encrypt your hard drive. So back it up, unplug it. Back it up again a week later, unplug it. I would use 2 or 3 different browsers. So I use one browser for most of my financial stuff, and then I use another browser for looking at funny cats. Because most software is designed for specific types of browsers, and so that keeps, you're most likely to get infected looking at funny cats than you are on your computer. Those are all the basic things that I would do. I still bank online, in part because as an individual you are protected. It's different if you're a small company. Small companies are not. But as an individual, the bank is going to cover my loss. That's how it works. So I bank online, but and I also have my computer's encrypted. So that is a whole other level that, again, only if you have things that would be incredibly damaging to your personal life or your business. My wife needs it. It's like, the password is like 35 digits long, and you have to do it every single time, but that's something to also.
Something that's basic. The U.S. government has invented the internet, and it controls the internet. If we transfer it to the U.N., what's the effect on all of us?
Yeah.
Is there any control?
Yeah.
And what does controlling the internet really mean?
So there has been this debate, right? There is no central organization that controls the internet. There are a group of technical organizations that design standards that agree on what technologies are going to be there. The closest to any kind of control was a group called ICANN, the Internet Corporation of Assigned Names and Numbers. This was created by the U.S. government to manage what's called the DNS system, domain name system, right? So the World Affairs Forum has an IP address. It's 12 digits, but so you don't have to type in those digits. You can type in World Affairs Forum and it automatically connects to what that IP address is. The yellow pages of the internet. That used to be controlled by a guy called John Postal, one person. Right? And there were only a certain number of addresses. He literally had stacks of paper with the address on it. It grew bigger and bigger, and the U.S. government created ICANN, which was this weird organization that was incorporated in California, had a contract with the Department of Commerce to oversee this domain name system. But ever since we created that, we said one day we're going to get internationalized. That was 1998. We finally did that last month. The U.S. government said we're going to internationalize the overseeing of the domain And Republicans in Congress, in particular Cruz, said this is handing over the internet to the Russians and the Chinese. I don't think that that's true. The DNS system does not control the internet. You could once change the addresses, but then everybody has to go up and set up their own DNS. Right? Each country can do it. So right now we have this global system that works for everybody, and you don't really want to mess that up. So if you try to do that once, you can get away with it once, then every other country would go ahead and do it. So there's really no way for any one organization to seize control. What has happened is we see more and more countries building their own internets that are separated through filtering, and censoring, and their own technology standards, with the Chinese and Russians and others. But in my mind, the transition was a good thing because we want to convince the Brazilians and the Indians and other countries didn't like it either. They didn't like ICANN. They didn't like it was incorporated in the U.S. They didn't like the government's kind of smaller voice in it than the private sector did. And those are the people we need to convince. We want to convince the Brazilians and the Indians, right? Complicated, multi-ethnic democracies that, yes, they have a stake in the governance of the internet. And so that's one of those things that creating this new organization, what we did was they created a new organization that's not tied to any government and not tied to any one organization. We don't know how it's going to work, but that's what we did.
Question. If a cyber attack were approved, at what level does it get approved? The president, and then who carries it out? What department or?
So as far as we know, and this is speaking from the leaked documents, the Stern documents, it has to be approved by the president. An offensive cyber operation, so one that's going to create some effect, has to be approved by the president. Espionage, those things don't have to be approved, but offensive cyber have to be conducted by the president. It would be launched by Cyber Command. So Cyber Command has now basically these teams would be positioned in the combatant commands, right? So Central Command deals with the war in Afghanistan. There would be a general there who says, all right, we're going to attack this Taliban structure. We think a cyber attack would be useful. It's going to create these outcomes, give me a plan. That would go to the president, and we can launch it.
From a strictly theoretical point of view, starting with a clean slate, and there are people who must look at this from a theoretical point of view, is it possible to create a perfect internet system that's entirely invincible, that can't be broken? I mean, I can think of reasons why it's not possible to do that, but what theoretical basis is there for that?
I mean, in some ways, right, it's the old engineering problem. Speed, security, convenience. Pick two of them. You can't have all three. There have been occasionally more than theoretical propositions to re-engineer the internet. And one of the main things you would do would be get rid of anonymity. Right? That would go a long way to reducing a lot of security risks. If everybody was tied to a specific machine and we could clearly identify who it was, then the attribution problem is going to go away. But I don't think any of us, at least in the West, would be willing to get rid of anonymity on the internet.
Thank you for your insight and also wonderful questions to get into a very profound problems. But thank you for also mentioning about the origin of the internet, ARPANET. I think most people didn't realize that internet originally was really totally different from the classical phone network. There's no central control. The routing systems is open, so we basically not know follow the routes. So, but I think that I want to from a very strategic level. Since we all, Americans especially, benefit from the internet because we used to be the phone call on this is very expensive. Almost everything is free, including the video. So Americans could theoretically put a private network, right? just using existing structure because using the naming method. The other way is that you can still using the packet network. You can use the kind of circuit switch, so you know the predetermined paths, so you can know, you can prevent people from invading it. What's the economic consequences between a U.S. private network to protect itself totally, and also the benefits of opening like an international network, and what would the downside of it? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. So of course the U.S. argues that everyone has an economic interest in the internet being as open as possible, right? And there have been studies done that show that open internet adds for developing countries, I can't remember, it's in the book, but 1 to 2% I think the GDP can add. And we know that closing off, especially if you have to shut down for an emergency, has severe economic effects, right? Egypt closed down, had severe. The test case, of course, would be China, right? So China has an internet more like the one you described, and the Chinese economy, the internet actually now is a larger part of GDP in China than it is in the U.S. and Germany. It's about 4.4 in China. It's now about 3.3 in the U.S. and Germany. So China is a pretty robust case that if you have a big enough market, that there might not be that much cost to having a more restricted. The question becomes, though, when Chinese companies want to globalize, right, which is what we're seeing, right? So Xiaomi, I mentioned earlier, the cell phone. As they globalize, they face many of the constraints that U.S. companies do. Right? Xiaomi got in trouble because the data from users in Southeast Asia was being sent back to Beijing, to Shenzhen, in China. And Southeast Asian users didn't like that. And so Xiaomi had to come up with some kind of thought about how are they going to be a more global player. The same thing with Huawei, right? Huawei has been shut out of more markets. So they also have an incentive to be a more open internet. But so far, at least in the early stages of development, if you're China, there's not a lot of cost. I assume if you're in Ethiopia, there's more cost. You're small. Last question.
There used to be these scenarios that there were things that made us more vulnerable as a country, like the power grid, things that would just totally decimate our capability to survive and prosper. What's happening to build defenses against cyber attacks in those critical arenas?
So, there's been a lot of work done on the power grid and the financial sector. How do you defend those things? Financial sector has generally been pretty good at it, right? Because that's where money is. Criminals have been attacking for a long time, and stress test the financial system quite frequently. So the thing about the power grid is that it's very decentralized. So to create a cascading failure is pretty hard, although we know that the Russians and Chinese have thought about it. Also, there's some benefits for being really old. Right? So legacy systems, right? You have to have a hacker who understands an energy power grid control system from the 70s and how to hack. So those things also create a kind of resilience that aren't there. But what we're seeing is a kind of basic questioning about, because everything is being connected to the internet. Right? I have to replace my garage door. And they tried to sell me one that's Wi-Fi enabled. And they said, well, you can open your Wi-Fi from work. I said, yes, but so can everybody else. So there's more of a question now about, does it have to be, we're beginning to see something, does it have to be enabled, by Wi-Fi enabled? And if we're going to do it, let's start building security in from the very beginning. Medical devices is a great example. Somebody just hacked an insulin pump last month. So if you're going to build these things, then there are reasons for them to be Wi-Fi enabled from the very beginning. We have to put security into them. But we see both a kind of rethinking about what needs to be connected, how do you build resilience into it, and also how do you operate if it goes down. Right? So the Naval Academy just, I think within recent years, just started teaching midshipmen how to navigate the Septuagint again. Right? How to use the stars. Because their fundamental assumption is that they're not going to have most of their systems. And so we have to start thinking like that. How do you operate if you can't rely on indigenous devices?